This is Book Public from Texas Public Radio. I'm Yvette Benavides. Tyon J. Coleman's book, Traveling Without Moving: Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America, is a collection of essays that helps us understand the inherent contradictions between American ideals and Black reality. Tyon J. Coleman shares intimate stories from her life in this book. She grew up in poverty in Chicago, experienced institutional racism and implicit bias in writing instruction contexts. She's witnessed the violent legacies of racism in the United States housing market, maternal health disparities across the country, and even the implications of these disparities in terms of her own miscarriage. She believes that a Black woman in America is always on the run, is always Harriet Tubman traveling with her babies in tow, seeking out safety, desperate to survive, to thrive, and to find freedom. The essays in Traveling Without Moving do what the best nonfiction does. They take the specific moments from a life and present them in ways that truly resonate, most especially with anyone who has had to work hard to succeed, anyone who has carried the wounds of childhood and used them to fortify their determination along life's sometimes treacherous paths. I spoke to Tyon J. Coleman about her book, Traveling Without Moving: Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. I'm going to say first, before I ask you the first question, how beautiful the book looks. The look of the book is gorgeous. It's impossible to resist it. I was talking to Colm Tóibín, who wrote this new book called On James Baldwin. It's like his appreciation of James Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked him, like, how did it begin? How did you first find the work of James Baldwin as, an Irishman? How did that happen? And he said, I was just in a bookstore. I didn't have to buy a school book. He was 18. I didn't have to buy a school book. I could buy any book I wanted. And I was just lured by the appearance of this book by James Baldwin, Go Tell It on the Mountain.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I felt with your book. That when I saw it and I saw the cover, I said, that's like the most beautiful book I've ever seen.
Well, thank you. I wish I could take credit for it, right? It's kind of interesting story. And one I just want to say, so thankful and honored, that the University of Minnesota Press accepted my work, and such an honor to work with Eric Anderson, who was my editor. And of course, I had all these ideals of, I wanted pictures of my family on the cover because my mom, died at 49, and we didn't have a lot of pictures, but the pictures we have, I love, and I put them everywhere.
Yeah.
And you get it. It's the intimacy of, you look at that picture 10 years ago, but then 10 years later, you look at the picture and you see more. But of course, we couldn't afford it and it wasn't possible. I struggled a lot with the introduction and thinking about the train in Chicago. And I love Chicago, right? It's my home, but it was also a place full of struggle. And writing that essay about the trains and this notion of, and sometimes I feel ashamed for this notion, right? I don't know if it's a very westernized thing. Maybe we can wax poetic about that. Sometimes you have to leave your home and to go outside of yourself in order to see yourself. But the irony is that when you think that you're looking at the other, you're never even still seeing the other. You're still just seeing yourself, right? This notion of the train is very haunting to me, and thinking about my mother and, when she was riding the trains in Chicago and that accident happened. I told him about my images. And so this is what whoever the wonderful people that they contracted with to develop it came up with. But again, I'm a big school believer of bootleg stuff, right? Because I'm the first person in my family to finish college. And so I'm sorry, we just grew up. I'm not trying to, put folks in jail, but you just bootleg stuff together. And I'm old enough, you just get some colored construction paper, put some plastic over it, boom, you got your bus pass. So they had sent us like 3 or 4 images. And I have a really good friend, and she was my colleague at St. Kate's, and her name was Anwa Wynn, and she's also just an amazing poet. And we were looking at these 4 pictures, and we were like, okay, here's the train in here, here's the image of the city in here, but does this look too urban? So she said, no, Ty, wait a minute. So she got out her scissors and we cut the scissors and we cut it and we paste it together. So we were like, I'm going to take this one from this picture, this one from this picture, and then put this one. And then we made one like composite picture together. And then I can remember we scanned it on the printer, right? And then in color, and I sent it to Eric, and I was like, okay, this is what we want to do. Do you got it? And they were like, yeah, yeah. And they did it. So that's how it happened. And I love visuals, and I can tell you that I love this picture of the L because it reminds me of being a kid in the 70s and 80s, taking the train as a young woman, something
Yeah.
that I would never let my kids now do, right, with all my privilege, right, but things that our parents had no choice but to let us do, right? And I like this picture because literally I said it looks like I could reach in and touch the gum stuck to the bottom of the chair.
Yeah.
And I could smell the urine, I could smell
Yeah.
the perfume, I could see the woman walking down selling fruit. I could see, the cute guy next to me, with the headphones on and the CD disc, because that's what was happening in the 80s and 70s. All the smells of the city and the movement. And I just said, oh, this is it. But also, too, I hope this doesn't make you uncomfortable. I also believe in the universe and serendipity. I don't think there's a such thing as coincidence.
Mm-hmm.
So I also feel it was a gift from the universe that I stepped toward it and it stepped toward me. And here we are. So I want to say thank you. I love this picture. I look at it. It promotes that feeling in me that I feel when I'm thinking about the book, even in ways that I didn't know when I was writing, that I think the picture reveals. And I hope that wasn't too long-winded to say, but that's such a great question to start with.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with me. I mean, it is totally evocative image, and I'm not from Chicago, and I totally understand what you're saying. For me, it was the city bus in Laredo, Texas,
Mm,
going
mm.
downtown or coming back home from school. Yeah,
And I imagine you knew where to sit, what places were safe, right? Who not
exactly.
to sit next to. If you smelled something, I'll sit this way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Isn't that something? And did you ride the bus by yourself?
I did.
How old were you?
I was in the ninth grade. I
Do you
was,
have any kids? I hope it's not too
I
forward
do,
for me to
I have a
ask.
daughter who's now 27. Yeah.
Would you have let her ride the bus like that? How you rode the bus?
I wouldn't let her do it even today.
I know. That's what I'm saying. My mother she would count out the tokens and she would press in my hand and she just if you they don't even use tokens anymore, but then they had tokens. So she's like, and if you lose this, you won't get back home. And I would literally get on the bus, then get on the train at 95th Street, then go downtown to Chicago Loop, right? Like who would let totally unaccompanied, right? Like by
Yeah.
myself. And so yeah, you get it, right? And in a
Yeah.
way it was scary, but also beautiful, but something that stays with us, right?
I want to ask you about the title,
Mm.
Traveling Without Moving, and the subtitle is Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. Tell me about the title, and for listeners who haven't yet read the book, tell me about Traveling Without Moving. It's an enigmatic title, but it really means so much. And then maybe lead into how this collection came to be.
Well, I can tell you that I used to listen, and I guess I still do, Jamiroquai, which is a musician, and he published an album, and on that album was Traveling Without Moving, and it was a song, and I would listen to it over and over again. And I would ride from Ames, Iowa, where I was at school at Iowa State, to Chicago, and I would just listen to it over and over again. But it's kind of like maybe poets, writers, we have this in common. It's something about rhythm or something that sticks with you.
Mhm.
And the album came out in 1996, and my mother died in 1997. And I thought it was so significant, this notion that we could be moving and traveling, but yet are we moving? Have things changed, right? And I want to be honest and say, that I liked the music and the beat at first, but then I thought his words were so provocative, and this notion of our parents who sacrificed so much for us to have better than what they have. And we get here and we get the accolades, we get the better things, we get the health care, we might live in a better neighborhood, but then you turn on the TV and George Floyd is choked out, right?
Mhm.
You turn on the TV and Black women are being murdered. Um, the life expectancy of African American women um, is still low, right? The infant mortality rate, and if you're educated, it's even more. So this notion that yes, time has moved, has traveled, or we've traveled this time, but in some sense, if we measure all the categories by which we qualify having a great life in America, have we moved? And let me be clear, I'm not being negative. I'm not negating the privilege I have, right? I want to acknowledge that ways that I can and ways I'm sure I imagine that I cannot, right?
Yeah,
But there's still something wrong with saying, yes, I've gotten all these achievements, but then somehow this acceptable loss of life, this acceptable marginalization of oppression of Black women and other people of color is acceptable. No, do you know what I mean?
I
Like
do.
things were supposed to get better, and although they might have gotten better for some people, that's still not acceptable if it's still not better for all of us. Does that make sense? And
Yep.
I somehow thought of my mom. You ask such great questions, thinking about how she put me on the bus and on the train, right? And understanding that I had to go and she had no choice. And it's kind of like life, right? Our parents spit us up and spit us out. They put us on this train, if this train or the bus can be the metaphor for how things move, hoping that on that journey there's going to be something better on the other end. And even themselves, they may not know, right? But they're still going to what, put us on that bus. They're still going to send us away. They're still going to do whatever they have to do in order to help us have better opportunities. And for those of us who are African American or of color, that doing whatever you have to do is almost like being Simone Biles, right? In the Olympics, that you're defying time and space, right? Just to end up even, right? Just to end up upright, right? And then when you still get there, you're still what, subject to poor health care. You're still subject to, you're more likely to die from hypertension or diabetes, right? Or heart disease. You're still subject to being arrested by the police and being abused by the police and, God forbid, murdered by the police. Do you know what I mean? So
Mhm.
yeah, so time has moved, but is 2024 any better than it was what, in 1964? So that's what I was thinking about and trying to tie all those things together. And I do think of it in terms of not just meaning, but also in terms of flow. And I think it's the poet in me too, right?
Mhm.
That I felt that even his song kind of evoked that. And I also think of writing as a flow, as music. And then thinking about the subtitle, that was a really kind of interesting conversation that I had with my editor, and we kind of went back and forth. And I appreciated him so much, right? Just having someone to help you like really think about what you think you're thinking about when you're writing. And I do think my essays are not about saying this is the answer. I'm saying this is a experience and a possible way to think about it. Does that make sense? I can only be a Black woman. I cannot be Black women, right? Because
Mhm.
even as we're constructed in these identities, no identity is a monolith, right? I cannot represent every single Black woman. Even if you got three of my sisters together and we grew up in the same house, we could describe the same incident completely differently, right? So I wanted to note that, yes, I'm a Black woman in America, but I'm just a Black woman, right? Among what, millions? It's only one experience. And then this notion that I'm trying to survive because I don't know yet if I have, right?
Yeah.
And I don't want to have the arrogance, right? And maybe that comes out of the culture, you know, that I'm from, descendant of African American slaves. You don't count your chickens till they hatch, right? Um, I don't want to be arrogant about it, but also the reality is, right? Here I am 54. Will I make 55, 56? I hope, right? But the onslaught is still real. And maybe ultimately, at the risk of being too wordy, is that I think that's what kind of hurts your heart, right? You do all these things that society says that you have to do to be acceptable. You do all these things that they say that measure success. I've gotten those pieces of paper. Okay, I've gotten this job. I've done these things. Then why can't you treat me fairly? Why can't you treat me equally? Why can't you treat my children in school without implicit bias, right? That's where we are. And it's a day to day thing. That's how I wanted to think about it, that it's just a drop in a much larger bucket,
Yeah.
hopefully to be in conversation with other Black women and other people and other human beings.
Well, you give me so much to think about, so many things I want to ask you about. One of the things you said is that you don't want to be negative, that you know that you've achieved things and you have things, and you don't want to be negative about it. And that's a very interesting idea to me. One of the things about your book is that you discuss so many, you're telling your own story, but within that story is a discussion of social and cultural issues that come to the fore just from the anecdotes that you share and the memories that you recall and these narratives that you weave. And it's really striking to me that one person's story, your story, your story, and how it connects to the story of your mother and your auntie and the other people in your family and your friends and these other people around you, and can still convey things about housing and health disparities and poverty and racism and violence. But the thing about the book is that you are composing these essays, and we go from childhood on up, and you tell these stories and these things about social issues and disparities and poverty and racism and violence still rise up to the top. And so when you say to me, I don't know if I'll be 55 or 56, but I hope so. I mean, that is a real fear. And it's so interesting to me how your book covers all of these very important topics that are informative for any reader of any background. And it just goes to show that the more you focus on the smallest details of your life, the more universally resonant it will be. And you know this as a writing
Mm-hmm.
professor.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say in one of the chapters, and you can choose the most arbitrarily mundane thing, and there's a whole story in there, and it's a story that's heavy with meaning.
Mm-hmm.
What has been your experience so far with the book and the ways that people respond to it? Because I feel like it's not just a book for Black women because you are a Black woman. There's universal I cannot tell you. I mean, I was moved to tears in parts of reading this. I mean, it's moving and it's poignant, but there are things that were very moving to me because I could relate to them. So I'm wondering if you've heard that from other readers so far.
I think, I'm still processing. I can say I was scared to publish it because there was so much shame around the stories, right? And most of them I published individually, but it just so happened how the universe worked. I published them with editors or in situations where I knew editors that were looking for work to include an anthology, and they were people or presses that I published, right?
Yes.
Because I think sometimes when we're oppressed, particularly as women, right, and how internalized misogyny works, you do all these twists and turns and you fall and you break down and all these ugly things happen in order for you to get where you are, and you show up well dressed, put together, you had your Listerine mouthwash, your breath is fresh, but you don't tell about all the hard stuff that you went through to
Yeah.
get there, right? Like I think about how when I was in high school, I haven't written about this with Catholic high school, and we have wear uniforms, and you have to wear pantyhose, but maybe you only had your last pantyhose, so you'd have the skirt on. You might have a big hole in your thigh. You put some fingernail polish on it so it doesn't spread even more, right? But you don't show that, so people don't see. So they just see your skirt and your pantyhose that aren't torn, and they think everything is okay. And I think for me, life has been like that. You show up and everything is okay, but inside, all this stuff is going on. Inside, there's this struggle, there's this violence and this trauma. But because society gaslights you, right? Society says, "Oh, that thing is not happening." So if you don't get it, if you don't have this experience or this is happening to you, it's your fault. You blame you. It never forces you to look at the structure, right? It always forces you to conform and to accept your experience is natural. And then that creates, I think, a lot of what mental illness, self-hatred, right? Anxiety, all the things that happen to us. Mm-hmm. So yes, for me, it was hard. These were stories that weren't supposed to be out. And again, I talked about my friend Anwar, like she convinced me to submit to the contest in which it was a finalist. I was working with another great writer, and this was during COVID, right? Everything was on lockdown. We were going to try to put together an anthology around Audre Lorde and this notion of sex and sexuality. And that, it didn't work out. We had other projects. And the editor, Eric Anderson, who was with this book, said, "Ty, I saw that your collection was a finalist in this, contest. Can I see it?" And I was like, "What?" He was like, "You heard me." Because of my, naivete, because we all got our stuff, right? I thought nobody's going to piece it together, right? I got an essay here, a poem here, an essay there. Nobody's going to see it together. So you're just showing a piece of your brokenness one collection at a time. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You're just getting parts of the story. You're not telling the whole story, right? But he's like, no, Ty, I want to see the whole thing. I was like, no, you don't want to see that. And I can remember it being COVID, and I'm on the couch, and I'm like, okay, well, you got to trust somebody, right? So I gave it to him, and he said we won. And I was like, you still what? So even now, I don't believe it, right? Even I don't believe it. So the biggest feeling I have is gratitude,
Hmm.
and very humbled by how well received it's been. It still moved me to tears. I remember the first interview I did with Carrie Miller on Minnesota Public Radio, and I still have not listened to it because it's hard to listen to. I
Hmm.
could not stop crying because I could feel my mother there with me so intensely. Because these are stories you don't tell. You're supposed to show up and look put together and be pretty and keep it moving, right? You're not supposed to talk about this. Society doesn't allow us. They just want to talk about the good and the bad. They don't want to lift up the skirt and see where you're using fingernail polish in order to keep from showing the tear in your pantyhose. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So for me, I just want to say I'm honored, I'm grateful, and you get this as a teacher. If it has some utility for someone, then I'm honored, right? And I think the humbleness comes from you can put a text out into the world. Yes, I can have these intentions, and in my ego, I can say, okay, this is what I was attempting to do. But ultimately, I know that the meaning of the text resides solely in the reader, right? It
Yeah.
resides solely in what the reader will find. And I think you're right. We want to acknowledge the ways in which we are different. But ultimately, right, and you started with Baldwin, whom I love. And I also love Irish writers. So to me, I think the universe was in sync that you just even started with that. I am honored and that people see that. And I'm just glad that I hope that I can contribute to somehow that people can see themselves. I'm hoping that people can heal, right? Forgive themselves and be good to themselves and others. But ultimately, like any true teacher, my hope is that I encourage other people to tell their own stories, right? To see the value in their experiences and to know that it's okay to tell a story that includes what both good and bad. And that I would say that's part of what living life is, at least for today, right? If you catch me another day, it might be something different because
Hmm.
I'm sure you know this too. The more we learn, the more we know nothing at all and a little shy. And I know people don't see me as shy, but I am. So yeah, it's a little unnerving to say what you're not supposed to say.
But I was saying to somebody, I feel like I want to make sure writing instructors and teachers know about this book. And then I thought, oh, I wish I'd had a book like this when I was growing up. The early chapter, the Thinar space, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your childhood. I don't know which is my favorite essay, but I really love the very young Ty, that little girl. And I can see, as you write about in poems as a mapping of human potential, I can see the potential and the ardor that she has for writing and reading and learning. And there's something in that little girl, Ty, who loves her blue Bic pen and her wine candy, her Jolly Ranchers, and the fresh, clean, cool, empty paper, the blank page that's in front of her. And then immediately there's a hard lesson to learn. Everything seems very promising. But can you talk a little bit about the Thinar space?
Yeah, thank you. And that originally appeared in a collection put together by Sherry Kwan Lee, specifically for BIPOC readers and teachers, right? Looking for work that not only talked about differences in terms of the construction of sexual identity, but gendered and other non-binary identities as well, right? Like very
Yeah.
intentional. So honored to be in that book. And now it's in its second edition. And it has been so popular and used in out the classroom. So yeah, just being humble. But again, another person I trust, she and I were in the MFA program together and she identified as Black and as Chinese. And it was interesting because when I came to the program, I said, did you have any other African American students? And I was told no. And she and I literally met in New York, or either in
Mm.
New York or Michigan at a Cave Column workshop. Like I had to cross the country. to meet
Wow.
her. But yeah, the NAR space is about my family, which is interesting because identities are so rigid, they don't allow the ways in which we show up differently. So my mother was raised in a small town in Southern Illinois, about 45 minutes east Missouri. Her great great grandmother was white German. And so here she is in a small town with this skin privilege in the midst of also of colorism and racism. And she was also Catholic because my great great grandmother was founder of the Catholic Church that was in the small town where my mother was from, which is how I ended up Catholic. And she married this city slicker from Chicago. And of course, I love my father, but I grew up with descriptions of him. They called, I can't even say it on the radio because this is public, but just talking about him in a very derogatory way because he was much darker than my mother.
Mhm.
And it was the notion that, as in some, again, I can only speak to my experience, but I grew up in African American families where if you had the privilege of being lighter than a paper bag, your job was to perpetuate that and to marry someone lighter. And my mother was that person. So, of course, for her to have all this skin privilege, right, and hair privilege of what people thought was right and beautiful, although I want to hold space to say that she was beautiful, right, the most amazing human being in the world. To marry this guy and to move to Chicago and live to a place that they thought was like Escape from New York. Do you remember that movie from the 80s, Escape from New York?
I
They
do.
thought it was like Escape from New York. And then he left her, right? So it's like, see, I told you, right? Like it was like I told you so. And I want to be clear, he didn't leave her, she left, right? She put her foot down, right? 5 kids, right? So part of her, guess, and my mama didn't talk much, right? Because she's like, I'm grown, right? You don't tell kids stuff in my family. It's very clear. She would send us to Sparta. And I loved it there. I mean, it was ways it was hard too. And that's what's so hard about family dynamics and sometimes dysfunction, that the pain and the love are wrapped together, right?
Mhm.
And it's hard to differentiate. But one of the things I knew that we would be there would be safe, and I knew that we wouldn't be hungry because there was always food. And that wasn't a lot of what we had in Chicago because of poverty. But I've always loved reading and I've always loved writing early on, love books. And yes, I wanted to write. And, I didn't know it then. I just thought, I was a crybaby. I was super sensitive, like there was something wrong with me. I was a big girl, as I'm a big, beautiful woman. And that wasn't valued. I was too dark. My hair was too kinky. That's the word they would use. And I was nosy. Like I asked questions. I said things that you weren't supposed to say. And when everybody was talking, particularly adults, I'm like, well, I want to participate. And so that's one of the earliest memories, but also too, and there but for the grace of God go I. When you get out of the space of just being in that immediate, like you were saying earlier, of that immediate circle, when you pull out, and again, I'm not excusing, abuse or causing pain, trying to see my family members doing the best they could with what they had. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And still giving me the best of what they could, even in the pain. And maybe trying to hold those two spaces or those multiplicity of spaces in the same place, maybe to in order to produce an essay where I could tell a story, I could have humor, but maybe there's a way too where I don't do the damage and perpetuate the pain. Does that make sense? Because I love them dearly. Yes, were some of them very mean? Absolutely. But I guess now I can see the narrative, I can see the stories, I can laugh. But also too, I feel like I have the privilege, right? That if it was my job to be the storyteller, although I didn't know it then, right?
Mhm.
And I was persecuted
Mhm.
and that pain was real. I
Yeah.
think I now have come to the point where no, that was my gift, right? All of those experiences prepared me for the work I was supposed to do. And I hope now, like any secret garden, right? And I know that sounds very overused term, but I want to use it to mean like I think our stories, our family members, our people, they are beautiful gardens that have endless fruit, right? Endless blooms. It's just for us to go back in and get it right. Adrienne Rich has this poem, Diving into the Wreck, right?
Mhm.
And how you keep going back in. And I feel like when I wrote that essay, I was going back in and seeing the beauty, seeing the humor, seeing myself. I feel like I can love myself and forgive myself. And then I hope too I can love my grandmother and my aunties and my pawpaw, and I can forgive them too. And maybe in some way, it not only then I think becomes an essay of art and tells a story, but also becomes a way that I can have forgiveness, so I can heal, but also in my privilege, I can say things that maybe they could not say. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that I could honor them and heal them. And and not to say that I will do it well, right? It is my prayer that my kids will do better than me. And then I ask them that they give me grace, right? Because I'm sure they will have the same stories about me. But if it was my job to try to tell as much as I could and much I could remember for what memory has its value, that's my hope. And I think in that essay, that is me. And I love the Thanar space because when I was looking it up in that space, I mean, and that would happen to me all the time. Remember those old, they probably should be illegal now, and they would clip, and they'd stick there, and you're like, oh, and you'd cuss and say the words you're not supposed to say.
The
Um,
binders, the
yeah,
binders
you
where
remember that, and it would always get you right there, right? But I can remember reading something online, and who says it's true? But when I was writing the essay, that people pinch that place not to cry, like it's supposed to stop you from crying,
it's the space
and
between your thumb and your that
and
web
your forefinger, yeah,
and your
that little web.
forefinger.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's supposed to, like, that's the space you squeeze. It's supposed to stop you from crying, like all kind of stuff. And I was the crybaby, and I'm still the crybaby, right? And so I imagine too that SA2 is kind of like the bridge where I've kind of accepted that that's okay to be who I was and to be who I am. And all of my life, it has been difficult to be the sensitive person. It has been difficult to be the crybaby. It's been difficult to see everything or what you believe that you see, right? Because I always want to humble and hold space for, what we're seeing is oftentimes about us, not really what we're looking at. And I think that in our space was realizing, oh, and I really was a writer, right? And that's what it means to be a writer. That's what it means. We do travel, but in a way, it's kind of like this sci-fi, multi-dimensional, slow space. We've collected all of these things, right? It sticks to us. It gives us pain. It hurts us. I imagine part of the reason why I struggle with high blood pressure is because I have all of these things. But then when I go to sit and I write the Thanar space and I write other things, then you offload, right? Then you unpack everything that we were or I was supposed to carry. And maybe in some way that's what writers do, right? That's what we do. We collect all of that, right? And then we offload and we tell the story. And as I age, I am so grateful for that time. And I'm sure my mother, she was just trying to keep her hair on her head, right? From not having to worry about two kids on the cusp of being teenage girls, right? And all the danger we could have gotten in. And I haven't written those essays about the dangerous things that we did in Sparta. So we'll keep that between you and me on that couch. I was the writer. Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, I think when we feel things so deeply, I think we also have like a really good sense of humor. And I have to say that I would turn the pages of this book as I was reading to see if there were any footnotes coming up because your your footnotes, yes, they are so rich with information and detail and attribution, right? All the academic things. Also, some of them are really funny. We learn about all kinds of things. I'm going to open up to page 5 because I have this in my notes. And the footnote on page 5 says, a reference to George Lucas's Star Wars and the Death Star seemed appropriate here, as in this moment I truly understood what the Force meant. And you go on. And it's like, oh my God, yes. Like this is so, the footnotes were so they just serve so many purposes. And sometimes it was, a very academic kind of thing, some esoteric idea, some attribution, or just something extra to help you understand what you were going through. And sometimes it was funny. And I love that. This is this is your life. I was going to say our life. This is your life. And life can be so absurd sometimes, and you capture those moments too in your book. I was going to ask you too about there is a coda in this collection called Sometimes I Feel Like Harriet Tubman.
Hmm. If my memory serves me correctly, Harriet Tubman had narcolepsy, right? She could pass out at any moment. As a child, she was beaten in the head because it was her job to take care of a small baby, and she was just a baby herself. But the fierceness of, they say that her father took her through the woods and showed her which way was north, what to do if you needed food, what mushrooms were safe to eat, which mushrooms were not. And then, of course, the story that everybody knows, that when she escaped one time, she had one person who wanted to go back, and she pulled out her gun and was like, look, I'll just shoot you now because you're already dead, right? And
Yeah.
then once she escaped, and then she came back to the same place helping people free themselves. And then, of course, during the Civil War, she was a spy, right? The scout, and basically helped to the North win the Civil War. And in my humor, which I admit, is kind of, probably people would say sick, but yeah, I've always loved to be funny. Again, thing that people say you shouldn't be. I can remember me and my sister using slavery as a metaphor for living life as educated Black people. And I remember one time my sister, who has an MBA, she had to go to work and she had an ID, and she was like, oh, let me get my plantation pass. Keep in mind, right, this notion of traveling without moving,
Yes.
everything became an analogy for slavery, right? So I didn't go to work. I worked at a plantation, right? Like,
All
I'm
right.
going to pick cotton. I'm leaving today, right? And it's just hilarious. And of course, it's sad, but there's some truth to that, right? I mean,
Yes.
come on. And so, yeah, and here I am. My mother was trying to Harriet Tubman me out of slavery, right? Because slavery, and I want to own, right? Let's hold space while you and I are talking right there. People are enslaved right now, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
no, my humor, you and I are not negating that. Like, it's very real.
Yeah.
But I think of, her working a job, going without food, using her weekly or biweekly paychecks to pay this little amount on our Catholic school education. She was literally trying to get us free, right? Get us off the plantation so that we could have better than she was. And then lo and behold, here I am. I have a partner with two advanced degrees. I have so many degrees, and then my children are being subject to racism in school. This notion that, yeah, we've traveled, but we haven't moved, and my kids are still enslaved, or you have a system that's still trying to enslave them, right? And so here I am, Harriet Tubman, trying to get my kids free. Like, that becomes my only objective. And I think about, did my mother feel the way that I feel? Or lo and behold, I can do so much more than my mother did. I can't imagine how she felt at night going to sleep, knowing that we didn't have enough food. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But still trying to get us off the plantation, still trying to get to the North Star, right?
Yeah.
Still trying to get free. And I think of Harris, who's running for president now.
Mm-hmm.
She's going to be the first, African American and Asian female president of the United States, because we're speaking that into reality. But how is she too like Harriet Tubman, right? Helping this democracy be what it says it's going to be. So I'm thinking about your analogy earlier, right? Kind of like, is it crescendo in music, where you move from the small point and it gets louder and louder? We can look at the individual story of an individual, but also see the structural political story, right? So here I am trying to get myself free. But in some sense, women of color, particularly African American women, right? Lawyers, judges, nurses, doctors, community organizers, teachers, vice presidents, candidate for presidency, we're still trying to get people free, right? Get people to a freedom, or get this country to be what it says it's going to be. If you're a democracy republic, what work can I do in order to make that happen? But then, unfortunately, I love the image of Harriet Tubman, not only because she's fierce and she's strong, and she says, no matter what, keep running, be free. Even with all that courage, even with all that sacrifice and that brilliance, you still want to keep us and our children enslaved. So, in a way, using these ancestors and these icons, we need to celebrate the strength, the courage, and the success, but it also still embodies the current oppression and how much work we still have to do, not only as individuals, but collectively as a society, right? Because Harriet Tubman could have gotten north and she could have chilled every day and drank iced tea, but she didn't do that, right? She's like, as long as there are other people who don't have what I have, I still have work to do. And in some ways, yes, I celebrate the successes that we have. I'm very proud to be an American citizen, but we still got work to do. We still have people who aren't free. And in some ways, we still trying to Harriet Tubman folks, right?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get and stay free. I'm trying to get my kids free. And I know you know this as a teacher of English and of writing, we're trying to get our students free. And how radical is it, right? For us to teach in a country where it was illegal for certain people to read and write.
Yeah.
And we won't even get into the experiences of where people are not allowed to speak their mother tongue or their first languages in school.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I think teaching writing is one of the most radical things you can do. So how could we not be Harriet Tubman, right? To be a teacher is to be Harriet Tubman. To be a leader is to be Harriet Tubman. To be of service is to be Harriet Tubman. So yeah, I love that image. It's humorous, but it's also powerful. And it also says so much, which are the spaces I like to occupy. I also, and no offense, right? Like, no offense to academics, whatever that means, right? Like, I'm the person who wasn't supposed to go to college, right? My high school counselor told me I wasn't college material.
Yeah.
So I've never felt like I was on the inside, right? I never felt like I was accepted. I've always had to go zigzag, right? It's never been a straight line. So then in that way, you can see in my writing, there's this kind of fracturedness that I've always felt in myself. This, you're hearing people speak, but it's not the voice you hear in your head, right? And so then I like to use images and icons that are not part of the institution, that are not part of the standard practice, because oftentimes, again, all due respect, but those images don't necessarily reflect what we're going through or how we feel. And I think I would hope my writing kind of shows that kind of a schism that I have felt all my life and being in academia.
Well, about that, you say in the essay, you can miss me with that because plantations were diverse too.
Yeah.
That there was a time when if someone had said to you that you would become a teacher as your career and your vocation, you would have said, this is what you say in the essay. You would have said that they had lost their mind. And then you go on to become a Black female tenured professor and now an academic dean, teacher of writing, a poet, an essayist, a writer. Right now, you and your husband and children are still, you write in the book, the only Black family on your block. But a story like yours, it seems to me, is still one, as you say, of traveling with maps that show that it is possible. Something important is possible. The life that you are living is possible even for someone else. So I'm wondering, what would you say right now to that young Black girl with her Jolly Ranchers and her big blue pen, encountering the empty writing paper and perhaps facing doubts and seemingly insurmountable obstacles? Another tie in 2024, another young girl maybe holding on to her Thanar space. What would you say?
I would say you're going to be all right. Don't give up. You are beautiful and gorgeous just the way you are. And don't stop being you. You will find yourself if you stay true to yourself. And don't desert her because she will serve you well. She is your source of power. Don't abandon yourself, no matter what. And give yourself grace.
Tyon Coleman, thank you. What a thrill. What an honor to get to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much. And peace and blessings to you. It's an honor and pleasure to meet you. And I just want to say thank you. Much gratitude.
Tyon J. Coleman is the author of Traveling Without Moving, Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. It's published by University of Minnesota Press. This has been Book Public from Texas Public Radio. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.